The dogwoods were blooming along Route 218, white and pink against the red Carolina clay, and Derek Simmons was going to be late for work again. He pressed the accelerator a little harder, watching the speedometer climb past 60, doing the math in his head. Drop the girls at school by 7:45, get to the Hendersons' place in Mint Hill by 8:30, finish the AC install by noon, pick up the girls at 3:15, get them to dance class by 4 noon, figure out dinner somewhere in between. The schedule was a puzzle with pieces that never quite fit, and every day he jammed them together through sheer force of will. "Daddy, you're going too fast." Mia's voice came from the back seat, serious and certain. "Daddy knows what he's doing, sweetheart." "Mama used to say that before she left," Emma added, and Derek felt the words land like a punch to the chest. He slowed down. 2 years since Karen had walked out. No note, no warning, no explanation. Just an empty closet and a text message that said, "I can't do this anymore." He'd spent months waiting for her to come back, to explain, to at least fight for custody of the twins. She'd done none of those things. As far as Derek knew, she was somewhere in California now, living a life that didn't include the family she'd left behind. The girls didn't talk about her much anymore. When they did, it was always like this, casual, matter of fact, like they were discussing the weather instead of the woman who'd given birth to them. Derek didn't know if that was healthy or heartbreaking. Probably both. He saw the motorcycle on the shoulder about a quarter-mile ahead, leaning at an angle that meant trouble. The rider was crouched beside it, examining something on the rear wheel. Derek's foot moved toward the brake before his brain caught up. "You're already late. You can't afford to stop. Someone else will help him." But even as the thoughts formed, he was pulling onto the shoulder, gravel crunching under his tires. Because his grandfather had taught him that a man stops when someone needs help. Because the girls were watching and he wanted them to see the right thing done. Because in the end, Derek Simmons couldn't drive past someone in trouble, no matter how many pieces of his puzzle it displaced. "Stay in the car, girls. I'll be right back." The rider stood as Derek approached. He was older, late 50s maybe, with a gray beard and weathered skin and the kind of eyes that had seen things they didn't talk about. His cut said, Carolina Iron Massey, Charlotte Chapter, and beneath that, Road Captain. "Morning," Derek said. "Looks like you've got some trouble." "Rear tire blew about a mile back. Rode the rim further than I should have." The man shook his head. "Stupid mistake. Haven't made one like that in 20 years. "You got a spare?" "In the saddlebag, but my back's not what it used to be. And changing a tire on one of these," he gestured at the Harley, "it's a two-man job, even on a good day." Derek checked his watch. 7:38. He was supposed to have the girls at school in 7 minutes. "I can help," he said, "but I've got to be quick. My girls have school." The rider glanced at the truck, at the 2 small faces watching through the window. "Twins?" "Yeah, Mia and Emma, 6 years old." "They're beautiful." Something shifted in the man's expression, a flicker of pain, there and gone. "My name's Ray. Most people call me Clutch." "Derek." He was already moving toward the saddlebag, pulling out the spare tire and the tools they'd need. "Let's get this done." They worked fast, the easy rhythm of men who knew their way around machinery. Derek jacked the bike while Clutch loosened the axle nuts, and within 15 minutes they had the blown tire off and the spare mounted. It wasn't pretty. The spare was meant for emergencies only, good for maybe 50 miles, but it would get the man where he needed to go. "That should hold until you can get to a shop," Derek said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "There's a Harley dealer in Concord if you're headed that way." "I know the one." Clutch straightened up, his hand pressing against his lower back. "What do I owe you?" "Nothing. Just needed to be done." "Let me at least—" "Mister, I've got to get my girls to school." Derek was already backing toward his truck. "Pay it forward sometime. That's what my granddad always said." He was in the driver's seat and pulling onto the road before Clutch could respond. In the rearview mirror, he saw the older man standing beside his bike, watching them go. "Daddy, why did we stop?" Mia asked. "Because that man needed help." "Are we going to be late for school?" "Probably a little bit." "Mrs. Patterson gets mad when we're late." "I know, sweetheart, but some things are more important than being on time." He made it to the school by 7:52, 7 minutes late, and walked the girls inside with a note explaining the delay. Mrs. Patterson gave him the look she always gave him, the one that said single father, probably can't handle it, but she took the note without comment. Derek drove to Mint Hill with his jaw tight and his hands gripping the wheel. The Henderson's AC install took longer than expected. It always did, in houses that old. And by the time he finished, it was past 2. He wolfed down a gas station sandwich on the drive to the next job, a quick service call in Matthews that turned into a full compressor replacement. He called the school to let them know he'd be late for pickup, heard the disapproval in the secretary's voice, and felt the familiar weight of failure pressing down on his shoulders. The girls were waiting in the front office when he finally arrived at 3:47. Emma had been crying. He could see the tracks on her cheeks, and Mia was holding her hand with the fierce protectiveness she'd developed since their mother left. "I'm sorry," Derek said, kneeling down to their level. "I got held up at work." "Mrs. Patterson said you forgot us," Emma whispered. "I didn't forget you. I would never forget you." He pulled them both into a hug, feeling their small bodies relax against him. "I just got stuck. It happens sometimes." "It happens a lot," Mia said, and Derek didn't have an answer for that. He skipped dance class, texted an apology to the instructor, added another failure to the list, and took the girls home instead. Home was a 3-bedroom ranch on 2 acres of scrubby land, inherited from his grandfather 5 years ago. It had been a good house once, solid and well-built. Now the roof leaked in 3 places, the foundation was cracking on the north side, and the county had given him 60 days to make repairs or face condemnation. 60 days. $23,000 in repairs, minimum. Derek made $47,000 a year before taxes. He had $612 in savings and a credit score that made banks laugh. He didn't know what he was going to do. That night, after the girls were in bed, Derek sat on the front porch with a beer he couldn't really afford and stared at the stars. The house creaked behind him, settling in ways that meant trouble, and somewhere in the trees a whip-poor-will called its lonely song. On the refrigerator inside, held up by a magnet shaped like a butterfly, was a drawing the girls had made last week. A house with a crooked roof, 3 stick figures holding hands in front, 2 small, 1 tall. Above them, in Emma's careful printing, "Our family. Family." Just the 3 of them now. And Derek was failing them. He finished the beer and went to bed and dreamed of roads that went nowhere and deadlines he couldn't meet. The next morning, the engines came. Derek was in the kitchen making pancakes when he heard it, a low rumble that grew until it shook the windows. Mia and Emma ran to the front door, pressing their faces against the glass, and Derek followed with a spatula still in his hand. There were motorcycles in his driveway, a lot of them, 20, maybe more, lined up in neat rows, their riders dismounting with the unhurried movements of men who had all the time in the world, and at the front of the pack, walking toward the porch with a slight limp and a smile Derek didn't understand, was the man from the roadside, Clutch. "Morning," the older man said. "Hope you don't mind us dropping by." Derek stared at him, at the bikes, at the men and women in leather cuts who were pulling tools and lumber from trucks that had somehow appeared behind the motorcycles. "What is this?" "This is payback." Clutch reached into his shirt and pulled out something on a chain. A ring, Derek realized, a class ring with a red stone. "My son went to school about 3 miles from here, graduated in 2008. He died 6 months later on Route 218. Same stretch of road where you stopped to help me yesterday." Derek's throat tightened. He didn't know what to say. "I ride that road every year on his birthday, just to remember. And yesterday, for the first time in 15 years, someone stopped." Clutch tucked the ring away. "You were late to work, weren't you? Late to pick up your girls?" "How did you—" "I made some calls, asked around about the man in the truck with the twin girls. People talk." Clutch's smile widened. "They also talk about houses that are falling apart, and county inspectors and deadlines that can't be met." Derek felt the blood drain from his face. "That's none of your business." "No, it's not." Clutch put a hand on his shoulder. "But you made it my business when you stopped to help a stranger on the worst day of the year, so now I'm making it mine." Behind him, the riders had started unloading supplies. Derek saw shingles, plywood, bags of concrete mix. He saw tool belts and ladders, and men who moved like they knew exactly what they were doing. "We've got roofers, foundation guys, electricians, plumbers," Clutch said. "All of them owe me favors, and none of them have anything better to do this weekend. So here's my question." He leaned closer. "You going to let us help? Or are you going to stand there with that spatula and pretend you don't need it. Derek looked at the riders, at the supplies, at his house, sagging and broken, held together by hope and duct tape. He thought about the drawing on the refrigerator, our family. "The pancakes are burning," he said finally. "Then you better go flip them." Clutch patted his shoulder. "We've got work to do." By noon, Derek's roof had been stripped down to the plywood. He stood in the yard with Mia and Emma, watching strangers crawl across his house like ants on a picnic blanket. The girls were fascinated. They'd never seen so many motorcycles in one place, never seen adults working together with such easy efficiency. Emma had already made friends with a woman named Patches, who had tattoos of butterflies up both arms and a laugh that could be heard from across the property. Derek didn't know what to do with himself. Every instinct told him to climb up there, to grab a hammer, to do something useful. But every time he tried, someone gently redirected him. "We've got this, brother. Go spend time with your girls. That's the work that matters." He wasn't used to being on this side of help, wasn't used to standing still while others carried his weight. "You look like you're about to crawl out of your skin," Clutch said, appearing beside him with 2 bottles of water. "Relax, they know what they're doing." "I should be up there." "Why, you a roofer?" "No, but then you just slow them down." Clutch handed him a water bottle. "I know it's hard. Believe me, I know. But sometimes the hardest thing a man can do is let people help him." Derek cracked open the bottle and drank without tasting it. On the roof, a man with a beard like a biblical prophet was directing the work with hand signals, and somehow everyone understood exactly what he meant. "Why are you really doing this?" Derek asked. "And don't give me that stuff about paying it forward. This," he gestured at the organized chaos around them, "this is thousands of dollars in materials, dozens of man-hours. You don't owe me anything close to this." Clutch was quiet for a moment. He reached under his shirt and pulled out the class ring again, turning it over in his fingers. His name was Tyler, 19 years old. He was coming home from his first semester at NC State, riding the bike I'd given him for graduation. Clutch's voice was steady, but something underneath it trembled. "A truck crossed the center line about a mile from where you stopped yesterday. Tyler never had a chance." "I'm sorry." "Yeah, everyone's sorry." Clutch tucked the ring away. "After he died, I wanted to disappear. Wanted to ride until I ran out of road or gas or reasons to keep going. My wife, she tried to hold on, but I pushed her away. Pushed everyone away. Spent 2 years being the angriest man in North Carolina." "What changed?" "The club." Clutch looked at the riders working on Derek's roof. "They didn't let me disappear. Showed up at my house, dragged me to meetings, made me eat when I forgot to, made me keep living when I'd rather have stopped. I didn't want their help. Fought it every step of the way. But they wouldn't let go." He turned to Derek. "That's what we do. That's what the club is for. Not just riding, carrying each other when the weight gets too heavy to carry alone." Derek thought about the last 2 years, the nights he'd sat alone after the girls were asleep, staring at walls and wondering how he was going to make it to morning. The phone calls he hadn't returned, the friends he'd drifted away from, the slow isolation of a man trying to prove he didn't need anyone. "I don't know how to do that," he said quietly. "Let people carry me." "Neither did I. Still don't most days." Clutch smiled. "But we learn. That's all we can do." The county inspector showed up at 2:17 p.m. His name was Gerald Hodges, and he drove a white county truck that looked like it had been washed recently, but not well. He was 52 years old, overweight, and visibly uncomfortable as he climbed out and surveyed the army of bikers that had descended on Derek Simmons' property. "Mr. Simmons," he clutched his clipboard like a shield, "I received some calls about activity at this address. I'm required to—" "Do your job. I know." Derek stepped forward, putting himself between Hodges and the work. "We're making the repairs. You can see that." "I can see a lot of people on your roof without permits." Hodges was sweating despite the mild spring air. "That's a code violation. I could shut this down right now." The hammering stopped. One by one, the riders turned to watch. Clutch moved to stand beside Derek. "We pulled permits this morning. County office opens at 8. I was there at 7:45. There's no record of—" "Check again." Clutch's voice was pleasant, but his eyes weren't. "Ask for Donna in the permits office. She'll remember me." Hodges pulled out his phone, made a call, and listened for a long moment. His face went through several expressions before settling on something that looked like reluctant acceptance. It seems the permits were filed. He lowered the phone. But I'm still required to inspect the work as it progresses. If anything isn't up to code, then we'll fix it, Derek said. That's the point. Hodges looked at the bikers, at the organized chaos, at the pile of rotted shingles growing beside the driveway. Something in his face softened, just for a moment. 60 days, he said. That's the deadline. If the repairs aren't complete and approved by then, I'll have no choice but to condemn the property. He tucked his clipboard under his arm. For what it's worth, I hope you make it. I've got no interest in putting a family on the street. He drove away, and the hammering resumed. He's not a bad guy, Clutch said, watching the truck disappear. Just a man with a job and rules he didn't write. I know. Derek rubbed his face. It's not him I'm worried about. Then what? Derek looked at his house, at the exposed bones of a building his grandfather had raised with his own hands. 60 days. Even with all this help, even if you fix the roof and the foundation and everything else, there's still the inspection fees, the permits, the electrical work that needs a licensed contractor. I've done the math 100 times. It doesn't add up. Then we find more numbers. Where? I've got $600 and a credit score that makes people wince. Banks won't touch me. My family's all gone except for an aunt in Florida who's on a fixed income. Derek's voice cracked. I appreciate what you're doing. More than I can say, but I think you might be fixing up a house that I'm going to lose anyway. Clutch was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You ever hear of the Iron Foundation? No. It's a nonprofit, started by some club members about 15 years ago, after... He paused. After Tyler died, we put together a fund to help families who fall through the cracks, people who work hard, do everything right, and still can't catch a break. I don't want charity. It's not charity, it's a hand up. Clutch met his eyes. You stopped on the worst day of my year to help a stranger change a tire. You were late to work, late to pick up your girls, and you didn't think twice about it. That's the kind of man the foundation exists to help. Derek wanted to argue, wanted to say he could handle it himself, that he didn't need anyone's money, that accepting help was admitting defeat. But he thought about the drawing on the refrigerator, our family. He thought about Mia and Emma, and what would happen to them if he lost this house. I'll think about it, he said. That's all I ask. That night, after the writers had gone and the girls were asleep, Derek sat on the front porch with his grandfather's Bible in his lap. He didn't read it much anymore, hadn't been to church since Karen left, hadn't felt much like talking to a God who let mothers walk away from their children. But he kept the Bible close because it had been his grandfather's, and because sometimes, when the weight got heavy, just holding it helped. Tucked inside the front cover was a photograph. Derek at 8 years old, standing beside his grandfather in front of this very house. The roof had been new then, the foundation solid, the whole place shining with fresh paint and possibility. A man takes care of his own, his grandfather had told him once, but a wise man knows when to let others help him carry the load. Derek looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he looked at the house, at the new plywood gleaming in the moonlight, where the old shingles had been stripped away. His phone buzzed, a text from a number he didn't recognize. This is Clutch. Foundation paperwork attached. No pressure, just options. He opened the attachment and started to read. In a small apartment on the other side of Charlotte, Gerald Hodges sat at his kitchen table with a beer and a folder full of inspection reports. His wife had left 3 years ago. Not dramatically, not with a text message or an empty closet, just a slow drift into separate bedrooms and separate lives, until one day she'd said, I think we should stop pretending, and that had been that. His kids were grown, scattered across the country, calling on holidays if he was lucky. He'd become a county inspector because he'd wanted to help people, keep them safe, make sure the houses they lived in wouldn't collapse around them. But somewhere along the way, the job had turned into paperwork and deadlines and saying no to families who couldn't afford to hear it. The Simmons file was on top of the stack. Single father, 2 kids, house falling apart. A man who'd clearly been doing his best, and having his best not be enough. Hodges had seen it 100 times, would probably see it 100 more. Most of those stories ended badly. Families displaced, children uprooted, lives disrupted because the world wasn't set up for people who struggled. But sometimes they ended differently. Sometimes someone showed up with a miracle. He thought about the bikers he'd seen today, the way they'd moved with purpose, with coordination, with the kind of commitment you usually only saw in families or soldiers. Whatever else they were trying to help a man keep his home. Hodges finished his beer and made a decision. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in months. "Hey Frank, it's Gerald. You still running that volunteer electricians program at the church? Because I've got a family who could use some help, and I'm wondering if we can't bend some rules." He listened for a moment, then smiled. "Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking." The roof was finished by Wednesday. The foundation work started Thursday. Derek watched it all from a distance, feeling like a stranger in his own home. Every morning, the bikes would arrive at dawn, sometimes 20, sometimes more, and the work would continue until dark. He'd tried to help at first, but the Riders had a system, and he was just getting in the way. So he made coffee and sandwiches and kept the girls occupied and tried not to think about the debt he was accumulating, not financial debt. Clutch had made it clear the labor was free, but the other kind, the kind that weighed on a man's soul. On Friday afternoon, the foundation paperwork arrived in his email. Derek read through it 3 times, checking the numbers, looking for the catch. There wasn't one. A grant of $15,000, no repayment required, specifically designated for families in housing crisis. All he had to do was sign, and the money would be in his account within 48 hours. He stared at the signature line for an hour, then he closed the laptop and went outside. Clutch was supervising the concrete work on the north side of the house, where the foundation had been cracking for years. He looked up when Derek approached. "You read the paperwork?" "I did." "And?" Derek shook his head. "I can't sign it." Clutch's expression didn't change. "Why not?" "Because it's too much. Because I don't deserve it. Because—" Derek ran a hand through his hair, trying to find words for something that lived deeper than language. "My whole life, I've taken care of myself, taken care of my family. When Karen left, I didn't fall apart. I kept going, kept working, kept putting one foot in front of the other because that's what you do. And now? Now I've got strangers fixing my house and offering me money and treating me like some kind of charity case, and I don't know who I am anymore." Derek's voice cracked. "If I can't even keep a roof over my daughters' heads, what kind of father am I? What kind of man?" Clutch was quiet for a long moment. Behind him, the concrete mixer churned, and men shouted instructions to each other in the easy shorthand of people who'd worked together for years. "You know what Tyler said to me the night before he died?" Derek shook his head. He said, "Dad, I know you think you have to do everything yourself, but that's not strength. That's just fear dressed up in work clothes." Clutch's voice was rough. 19 years old, and he understood something I didn't figure out until after he was gone. "What's that?" "That letting people help you isn't weakness, it's trust." Clutch put a hand on Derek's shoulder. "You stopped to help me on the side of the road. You didn't know me anything. You just saw someone who needed help and you helped. Why is it so hard to let someone do the same for you?" Derek didn't have an answer. He looked at the house, his grandfather's house, his daughter's home, and felt the weight of everything pressing down. "I need to think," he said. "Take all the time you need." "But Derek?" Clutch's grip tightened. "Don't let pride steal your daughter's home. They don't care if you're strong. They just want their daddy." That night, Derek dreamed about his grandfather. They were standing in front of the house the way they had in the photograph, only now the house was falling apart, walls collapsing, roof caving in, foundation crumbling to dust. Derek tried to hold it up with his bare hands, but it kept falling, kept breaking, and his grandfather just stood there watching. "You can't do it alone, son," his grandfather said. "Nobody can. I have to try." "Why?" Derek woke up without an answer. Saturday morning brought rain, a hard, driving storm that turned the yard to mud and sent the Riders scrambling for tarps. Derek stood at the kitchen window, watching them work in the downpour, and felt something shift inside his chest. These people didn't have to be here. They had families of their own, jobs of their own, lives that didn't include a struggling single father and his falling down house, but they'd shown up anyway, day after day, in the heat and now the rain, asking nothing in return. Why was he fighting so hard to refuse them? The answer came slowly, rising from somewhere he'd kept locked away since Karen left. Because if he accepted help, he had to admit he needed it. And if he needed help, he had to admit he wasn't enough. And if he wasn't enough, if he couldn't hold everything together on his own, then maybe Karen had been right to leave. Maybe he really was the failure she'd seen when she'd walked out the door. Derek pressed his forehead against the cold glass. "I can't do this anymore," Karen had written. "I can't do this anymore." He'd spent 2 years believing those words were about him, about his inability to be what she needed, provide what she wanted, hold together a family that was always on the edge of falling apart. But maybe they weren't about him at all. Maybe they were about her, her fears, her limitations, her inability to stay when staying got hard. Maybe her leaving said more about her than it did about him. "Daddy?" He turned. Mia was standing in the kitchen doorway, her hair tangled from sleep, her eyes worried. "Why are you crying?" Derek touched his face and was surprised to find it wet. "I'm okay, sweetheart. Just thinking." "About what?" He looked at his daughter, 6 years old, fierce and fragile, carrying burdens no child should have to carry. He thought about Emma, still asleep upstairs, dreaming whatever dreams 6-year-olds dreamed. He thought about the house and the deadline, and the men outside working in the rain because a stranger had stopped to help one of their own. About how sometimes, he said slowly, the strongest thing you can do is ask for help. Mia considered this with the gravity of a child who'd learned too young that the world wasn't always kind. "Like when I help Emma with her shoes." "Exactly like that. That's not weak, that's just being sisters." Derek smiled. "Yeah, I guess it is." He walked to the laptop, opened it, and signed the foundation paperwork. The rain stopped by noon. By 2 o'clock, the sun was out, steam rising from the wet ground, and the riders were back to work like nothing had happened. Derek found Clutch on the porch, drinking coffee and watching the activity with the satisfied expression of a general surveying his troops. "I signed it," Derek said. "The paperwork." Clutch nodded. "Good. I still don't know how I'm going to pay everyone back." "You already did. 2 years from now, 5 years, 10, somewhere down the road, you're going to see someone who needs help, and you're going to stop, just like you stopped for me." Clutch raised his coffee cup. "That's how it works, not keeping score, just keeping faith." Derek sat down beside him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "Clutch." "Yeah?" "Tell me about Tyler." The older man was quiet. Then he reached under his shirt and pulled out the class ring, holding it so the red stone caught the light. He wanted to be a teacher. History. Said someone had to make sure people remembered where they came from. Clutch's voice was steady, but his eyes were bright. He had his mother's laugh, and his grandmother's stubbornness, and this way of looking at you that made you feel like you were the most important person in the world. "He sounds like a good kid." "He was. Best thing I ever did." Clutch tucked the ring away. "Losing him nearly killed me. Some days I think it did kill me. Killed the man I was, anyway. But the club, the foundation, all of this..." He gestured at the riders, the work, the house slowly being rebuilt. "This is what grew out of that death. Tyler's legacy, his way of still being in the world." Derek thought about his own legacy, the house his grandfather had built, the girls his wife had abandoned, the life he was trying to hold together with nothing but stubbornness and fear. "I want to do something," he said. "When this is over, I want to be part of what you're doing." "You already are." "I mean more. I mean really part of it." Derek met Clutch's eyes. "I'm good with my hands. I know HVAC, plumbing, basic electrical, and I know what it feels like to be drowning and not know how to ask for help." Clutch studied him for a long moment. Then he smiled. A real smile, the first one Derek had seen from him. "Let's get your house finished first. Then we'll talk about the next one." The work continued through the weekend. By Sunday night, the roof was sealed, the foundation was solid, and the electrical team, organized by Gerald Hodges' friend Frank, had started rewiring the outdated panels. The county inspection was scheduled for Tuesday. Derek stood in the yard as the last of the bikes pulled away, their taillights disappearing into the darkness. The girls were asleep inside, exhausted from a day of helping that mostly meant getting underfoot and being adored by everyone they met. In his pocket, his phone buzzed. A text from Clutch. "Get some sleep. We finish this tomorrow." Derek looked at his house, battered but standing, broken, but healing. Tomorrow. They'd finish it tomorrow. And then, maybe, he could start building something new. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of Carolina blue sky that made everything feel possible. Derek was up before dawn, walking through the house with a cup of coffee, checking and rechecking every repair. The roof was solid. No more buckets catching drips. No more water stains spreading across the ceiling. The foundation had been shored up with new concrete and steel reinforcement that would last another 50 years. The electrical panels gleamed with new wiring, and the plumbing no longer groaned like a dying animal every time someone flushed a toilet. It was the same house his grandfather had built, and it was completely different. The girls were still asleep when the first bikes arrived at 7. Clutch was at the front, same as always, followed by a smaller crew than the weekend. Just the core members who'd been there from the beginning. They parked in a neat row along the driveway and dismounted without their usual chatter. "Big day," Clutch said, walking up the porch steps. "Yeah." Derek's stomach was tight with nerves. What if he finds something? What if there's a code we missed or a permit we forgot? Then we fix it. Clutch put a hand on his shoulder. "Stop borrowing trouble. We've done good work here. It'll hold up." Gerald Hodges arrived at 9:17, driving the same White County truck, carrying the same clipboard. But something about him seemed different today. Lighter, maybe, or more at ease. He nodded to the bikers as he walked past them, and if Derek wasn't mistaken, there was something almost like respect in his eyes. "Mr. Simmons, ready for the inspection?" "As ready as I'll ever be." They walked through the house together, Hodges making notes, checking outlets, testing fixtures. He spent a long time in the attic, examining the new roofing from underneath. He spent even longer at the foundation, running his hands along the concrete, tapping the reinforcement beams. Derek followed in silence, his heart pounding. Every pause felt like a verdict. Every scribble on the clipboard felt like a sentence. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably 45 minutes, they ended up back on the front porch. The riders had gathered in a loose semicircle, their faces carefully neutral. "Well," Hodges said. He flipped through his notes, his expression unreadable. "I've been doing this job for 23 years. I've seen a lot of houses, a lot of repairs, a lot of families trying to hold things together." Derek's hands were shaking. He shoved them in his pockets. "This is some of the best work I've ever seen." Hodges looked up and he was smiling. "Not just up to code, above it. Whoever did your electrical work should be charging double. Your foundation guy is an artist, and that roof—" He shook his head. "That roof will be standing when my grandchildren are old." Derek couldn't speak. He felt his knees go weak, and locked them to stay upright. "I'm signing off on the repairs. The condemnation order is lifted, effective immediately." Hodges tucked his clipboard under his arm and extended his hand. "Congratulations, Mr. Simmons. You get to keep your home." Derek shook his hand. His vision was blurring, and he blinked hard, trying to hold himself together. "Thank you," he managed. "For everything. Not just the inspection." "I know." Hodges glanced at the riders, at the house, at the life that had been saved through the combined efforts of strangers who'd chosen to care. "Sometimes this job reminds me why I started doing it in the first place." He walked back to his truck, and a cheer erupted from the gathered bikers. Someone clapped Derek on the back. Someone else was already pulling beer from a cooler that had materialized from somewhere. The girls burst through the front door, still in their pajamas, drawn by the noise. "Daddy, what's happening?" Emma asked. Derek dropped to his knees and pulled them both into a hug. "We get to stay," he said, his voice breaking. "We get to stay in Grandpa's house." "We were always going to stay," Mia said with the confidence of a child who didn't understand how close they'd come to losing everything. "This is our home." "Yeah." Derek held them tighter. "It is." The celebration lasted most of the day. Someone had called in reinforcements, and by noon, there were 40 bikes in the driveway and a barbecue smoking in the backyard. The girls ran wild through the crowd, being lifted onto motorcycles for photos, eating hot dogs until their faces were smeared with ketchup, making friends with everyone they met. Derek moved through it all in a daze. People kept shaking his hand, clapping his shoulder, telling him stories about houses they'd helped save and families they'd pulled back from the edge. He smiled and nodded and tried to remember names, but mostly he just felt the overwhelming reality of what had happened. He still had a home. His girls still had a home. And it had happened because he'd stopped on the side of the road to help a stranger change a tire. Late in the afternoon, he found himself standing alone at the edge of the property, looking at the house from a distance. The new roof gleamed in the sunlight. The foundation stood solid and true. It looked like a house with a future. Clutch appeared beside him, holding 2 beers. Hell of a day. Hell of a week. Derek accepted the beer. Hell of a life lately. It gets easier. Not easy. Never easy, but easier. Clutch took a long drink. The hard part's over. Now comes the living. I've been thinking about what I said, about wanting to be part of this. I remember. I meant it. Derek turned to face him. I don't know how much help I can be. I've got the girls and work and 100 other things pulling at me, but whatever I can give, I want to give it. Clutch reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. He pressed it into Derek's hand. It was a patch. Carolina Iron MC, friend of the club. You're not a member, Clutch said. That's a different commitment, a different life. But this, he nodded at the patch. This means you're one of us. You ride with us when you can. You help when there's helping to do. And when you need us, we're there. Derek looked at the patch, at the worn leather and the stitched letters. It weighed almost nothing. It meant everything. Thank you. Don't thank me. Thank yourself. You started this whole thing by being the kind of man who stops. Clutch finished his beer. Now you just keep being that man. That's all any of us can do. The party wound down as the sun began to set. Bikes rumbled out of the driveway in 2s and 3s, riders calling goodbyes and promises to come back soon. The girls fell asleep on the couch, exhausted and happy, their faces still sticky with barbecue sauce. Derek carried them to bed one at a time, tucking them in, kissing their foreheads, standing in the doorway for a long moment, just watching them breathe. His girls, his home, his life. He'd almost lost all of it, and he'd gotten it back, not because he'd been strong enough to hold on alone, but because he'd finally been brave enough to let go. He walked to the kitchen and took his grandfather's Bible from the shelf where he'd placed it that morning. He opened it to the photograph, the boy and the old man standing in front of a house that had just been built, and looked at it for a long time. A wise man knows when to let others help him carry the load. Derek slid the friend of the club patch into the Bible next to the photograph. 2 generations of the same lesson finally learned. Outside, the last motorcycle was pulling away. Derek walked onto the porch and watched its taillight disappear around the bend. The house stood solid behind him. The stars were coming out overhead, and somewhere in the distance an engine rumbled, a sound that used to mean strangers passing through, but now meant something different. Now it meant family. He thought about calling his aunt in Florida, about reconnecting with the friends he'd pushed away, about all the people he'd held at arm's length because he'd been too afraid to admit he was struggling. Tomorrow, he'd start making those calls. Tomorrow, he'd begin rebuilding more than just a house. But tonight, he just stood on the porch of his grandfather's home and watched the stars come out, one by one, until the whole sky was bright with light. The front door opened behind him. Small footsteps padded across the porch. "Daddy?" Emma's voice, sleepy and soft. "I had a bad dream." Derek turned and lifted her into his arms. She was getting too big to carry, but he wasn't ready to stop. "What was it about?" "I dreamed the house fell down, and we had to live in the car. That's not going to happen." He held her close, feeling her small heart beating against his chest. "The house is fixed now. It's going to stand for a long, long time." "Promise?" "Promise." She was quiet for a moment, her head on his shoulder. Then she said, "Daddy, those motorcycle people were nice." "Yeah, they were." "Are they our friends now?" Derek thought about Clutch, about Tyler, about all the hands that had worked to save this place. He thought about the patch in his grandfather's Bible and the road that had brought him here. "Yeah," he said, "they're our friends now." Emma yawned. "Good. I like having friends." He carried her back inside, back to bed, back to the room where she'd sleep safe and warm, in a house that wasn't falling down anymore. Mia stirred as he passed, but didn't wake, her hand reaching out in sleep to find her sister. Derek stood in the doorway and watched his daughters, watched the moonlight fall across their faces, watched the rise and fall of their breathing, steady and peaceful. "Our family," the drawing on the refrigerator said. 3 stick figures holding hands. It was enough. It had always been enough. He'd just been too lost to see it. He closed the door softly and went to bed, and for the first time in 2 years, he slept without dreaming of everything he might lose. The dogwoods bloomed again the following spring, white and pink against the Carolina clay, and Derek Simmons was running late. But this time, it was different. "Daddy, we're going to miss the pancakes." Emma bounced in her booster seat, her face pressed against the window. "We're not going to miss the pancakes. We're bringing the pancakes." In the back of the truck, covered with foil, were 6 dozen pancakes Derek had made that morning. His grandmother's recipe, perfected over a year of trial and error. Beside them sat 3 jugs of syrup and a cooler full of bacon that Mia had insisted on supervising. The VFW Hall parking lot was already full when they arrived. Bikes lined the perimeter like chrome soldiers standing at attention. Children ran across the grass while adults set up tables and unfolded chairs. A banner stretched across the entrance read, "Iron Foundation Spring Fundraiser, Thursday Annual." Clutch met them at the truck, helping unload the food. "You're late." "I'm always late. You should know that by now." Some things never change, but Clutch was smiling, and Derek understood that some things had changed, everything that mattered. The past year had reshaped Derek's life in ways he couldn't have imagined. He'd joined the Foundation's volunteer roster, spending 2 Saturdays a month helping repair homes for families who'd fallen on hard times. He'd reconnected with his aunt in Florida, who'd cried on the phone for 20 minutes when he finally called. He'd even started going back to church. Not every Sunday, but enough. Enough to feel like he was part of something larger than himself. The girls had changed too. Mia had lost some of her fierce protectiveness, no longer needing to guard her sister against a world that seemed intent on taking things away. Emma talked more now, laughed easier, had stopped asking when Mommy was coming home. They'd made friends with the children of other club members, forming a loose tribe that gathered at every event, every fundraiser, every excuse to be together. Family, Derek had learned, wasn't just blood. It was choice. It was showing up. It was letting people in, even when every instinct said to keep them out. Uncle Derek, a boy named Marcus, Clutch's grandson, named for his great-grandfather, came running across the parking lot. "Mom says you promised to teach me how to flip pancakes." "Did I say that?" "You said it last month. I remember everything." Derek laughed. "Then I guess I better keep my promise." He spent the next hour at the griddle, teaching Marcus and a rotating cast of children the proper technique for pancake flipping. Most of them ended up on the ground. Nobody cared. The laughter was worth the mess. Around noon, Clutch found him sitting on the tailgate of his truck, watching the crowd. "Good turnout this year. Best one yet." Derek took a sip of his coffee. "How much you think we'll raise?" "Enough for 2 more houses, maybe 3. The matching grant from the hardware chain came through last week." Clutch settled onto the tailgate beside him. "We've got a family in Gastonia, another one in Kannapolis. Single mom, 3 kids. Roof's about to cave in. I can take lid on the Kannapolis job. Got some vacation days saved up." "I was hoping you'd say that." Clutch reached into his pocket and pulled out Tyler's class ring. He did that sometimes, just held it, let the sun catch the red stone. "He would have liked you." "I wish I could have met him." "You did meet him. Every time you help someone who can't help themselves, every time you teach a kid to flip pancakes, every time you choose to stay when it would be easier to leave, that's Tyler. That's what he wanted to put into the world." Clutch tucked the ring away. "Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you put into motion." Derek thought about his grandfather, about the house that had been saved, about the photograph still pressed between the pages of the family Bible alongside the friend of the club patch. "My girls are doing a project at school," he said. "Family history. They want to interview me about our ancestors, where we came from, all that." "What are you going to tell them?" "The truth. That we come from people who built things and fixed things and didn't give up when times got hard." Derek watched Mia and Emma running across the grass with Marcus and the other kids, their laughter carrying on the spring breeze. "And that we come from people who weren't afraid to ask for help when they needed it. That's a good legacy. It's a start." The fundraiser wound down in the late afternoon. Families packed up their chairs, bikers mounted their bikes, children complained about having to leave. Derek loaded the girls into the truck and rolled down the windows, letting the warm air fill the cab. "Daddy?" Mia's voice came from the back seat. "Yeah, sweetheart. Are we going to come back next year?" Every year, as long as they'll have us. Good. She was quiet for a moment. I like who we are now. Derek glanced in the rearview mirror, caught her serious eyes watching him. Who are we now? People who help, she said simply. That's better than just being people who need help. We're both, sweetheart. Everyone's both. Mia considered this with the gravity of a 7-year-old philosopher. I guess that's okay. Yeah, it's more than okay. He pulled out of the parking lot and onto the highway, heading home. The dogwoods blurred past, white and pink against the red clay, and somewhere behind him, the first motorcycles were starting their engines, heading out to wherever the road would take them. Derek thought about the morning a year ago when he'd stopped to help a stranger change a tire. Such a small thing. 5 minutes of his day, a little grease on his hands, a few words exchanged with a man he'd never expected to see again. And look what had grown from it. The house appeared around the bend, solid and whole, the new roof gleaming in the afternoon light. The yard needed mowing, the flower beds needed weeding. There was always something that needed doing, but it was home, it was theirs, and it was standing. Derek parked in the driveway and sat for a moment, hands on the wheel, watching the girls unbuckle themselves and tumble out of the truck. They raced each other to the porch, arguing about who would get to the door first, their voices bright against the quiet countryside. He thought about all the families he'd helped this year, all the roofs he'd patched, the foundations he'd reinforced, the hands he'd shaken, and the stories he'd heard. Every one of them reminded him of himself, struggling, proud, afraid to admit they couldn't do it alone. And every one of them had taught him the same lesson. The strongest thing a man could do wasn't holding everything together by himself. It was opening his hands and letting others help him carry the load. Derek climbed out of the truck and walked toward the house where his daughters were waiting. Behind him, somewhere in the distance, an engine rumbled. He smiled and didn't look back. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness sets the biggest things in motion. You never know whose life you might change, including your own. If this story moved you, subscribe so you never miss one. And tell us in the comments, when was a time a stranger's help changed everything for you?